We seem to have a bit of dueling narratives this morning, don't we? Two very different Pentecost stories. The Pentecost story from the Acts of the Apostles is the one that we're probably the most familiar with. And if you want to know what this story feels like, just remember what was said about it. There's a sound like the rush of a violent wind. There are tongues of fire that pop up out of nowhere. The disciples start speaking in tongues and different languages, with the traditional sign of the presence of the Holy Spirit, a cacophony of confusing noise. And then you have Peter, who comes into his own, finally, with this powerful speech, this call to discipleship. He quotes from the prophet Joel, talking about the last days and prophecies and visions and dreams and signs and portents, blood, fire, smoky mist. The sun will turn to darkness, the moon to blood. I mean, this is an earth-shattering, earth-moving occasion. The coming of the Holy Spirit in the Acts of the Apostles is not the little dove that we get in Jesus' baptism, or that is a usual and typical image of the Holy Spirit. Instead, we get the fire, which I don't think I have on my stole. I can't remember. But on all of our banners, there's fire. And the candles, the Paschal candle lit during the season of Easter, of which Pentecost is the last day. This is the story of Pentecost. This is the coming of the Holy Spirit in the Acts of the Apostles. And because it's so exciting and so visual, it's probably the story of Pentecost that we like to hear the most. But it's not the only Pentecost story, is it? Because our reading from the Gospel according to John is also a story of Pentecost and the coming and giving of the Holy Spirit. In the Gospel according to John, Pentecost happens on Easter Day. Not 50 days after, on Easter Day. And we're used to Easter being a day of bright and joyous celebration, of laughter, of happiness. But here, it's evening, and the disciples are afraid. They're so afraid that they're hiding in the upper room, and all the doors are locked. Remember, this is after Mary Magdalene and the women come from the tomb, bursting into the room and saying, "I have seen the Lord." This message of good news that should have propelled the disciples out into the world, and yet here they are in the dark, hiding. Clearly, they didn't listen to the women. Always listen to the women. Okay? Still, in the midst of that fear, in that locked room, Jesus comes and stands with them and declares to them peace. Peace from their fear of other people that they thought were trying to harm them. Peace from their worry over their own lives. Peace from their self-doubt over their callings and the mission Christ had given them. Peace from their anxiety about the future and what that looked like and what that would bring to them. It's a comforting story that contrasts sharply with the fiery, loud, bombastic story in Acts. Yet both are necessary. And in fact, both are related. These past few weeks, we've heard about the Holy Spirit and how God uses the Holy Spirit and how the Holy Spirit uses us. Called in our baptisms, the Holy Spirit gives us the strength and the courage to actually live out that call, to intentionally live connected to a community of faith, to, as we are bombarded by words and news and information and conflicting stories from all around us, to focus our lives primarily around the story of Jesus Christ. to openly and boldly share the good news that motivates us with others through not just our words, but also with our actions, the way we live out our daily lives. The call to reject the consumerism and individualism of our culture that tries to force us up a ladder of success whose rungs are made from the bodies of those we step on to get ahead. The call to never stop pushing and striving for justice and peace in all the earth. Holy Spirit has called you to do all of these things, has equipped you not only with your own personal and varied gifts, but with this community, even meeting dispersed throughout the world, to give you more courage and to give you more faith than you have on your own, to support you, to guide you, and to follow you where you lead. Are you ready to do that? Are you ready to live out your calling with this community of faith? Well, normally preaching is all about good news, but I've got some bad news for you this morning. And that's Holy Spirit has called you to do this and sends you out to do it whether or not you're ready. Whether you think you're ready. The theme that comes up in the stories this morning is this being the last days. And this certainly feels like the last days, doesn't it? The end of the world. Not only are we all still reeling from this continued COVID-19 pandemic, and yes, I'm bad. I forgot my mask this morning. Please do not follow my example. Do as I say, not as I do in this particular instance. So not only are we still suffering from COVID-19, but in our country, emotions and tensions from our continued and supported systemic and communal sin of racism have exploded yet again. Protests and riots in Minneapolis, Las Vegas, here in Indianapolis, Chicago, New York, Phoenix, Portland, Salt Lake City, Columbus, Des Moines, Washington, D.C., Sacramento, Oakland, San Jose, Los Angeles, Denver, Boulder, Jacksonville, Atlanta, Boise, Idaho, Louisville, Boston, Detroit, St. Louis, New York, Albuquerque, and on and on and on and on. Protests erupting all over our country. Skirmishes with law enforcement dressed in riot gear and firing tear gas and rubber bullets into peaceful assemblies. States of emergencies being declared, the National Guard being called out. Where things are not peaceful, buildings are on fire, cars are turned over, rocks and water bottles are thrown at officers, arrests are being made, even of journalists covering the protests. The racial discrimination and oppression sown into the very soil of the United States, woven into its very fabric, written into its Constitution, has erupted again, spilling out like a wound, blood on the ground. The murder of George Floyd may have been the fatal catalyst, but the protests aren't just about Floyd. They're about Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Eric Logan, Dejon Reed, Eric Gardner, Philando Castile, Martin Luther King Jr., the generations of black and brown Americans that have been laid out on the altar of white supremacy and sacrificed. In these last days, it can feel like the disciples huddled in a room, afraid of what's happening outside. For some, they are huddling in a room, hoping that the violence passes, that they won't be the next victims. We need peace. We need peace for ourselves, but not the false peace that is the absence of conflict, that doesn't address any of the issues at present. A shroud of peace cast over the bulging abscess of business as usual, and just wait, justice is surely coming in time. But as the Reverend Dr. King reminds us, that the words wait always mean never. That being told to just wait doesn't address anything, doesn't fix anything, and only ensures that the tensions continue to grow until they erupt again. We don't need that peace. What we need is peace to calm ourselves. We need peace to trust ourselves. We need peace to ready ourselves. And we need this peace for ourselves so that we can leave the locked room and go out. So that we can go out and work, do the hard work of justice and peace in all the earth, as our baptisms demand of us, as the Holy Spirit demands of us, whether we're ready to go out or not. We need this peace in ourselves so we can bind the sin of racism and cast it out into the abyss where there is weeping and a gnashing of teeth, never to rear its ugly head in our lifetimes, in our country, in our world again. And in binding that sin, we loose ourselves and our society from the rot and the sickness that we have ignored for far too long. We need this peace so that through the Holy Spirit, we can proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ, the good news of healing, salvation, and wholeness for all of creation, so that we have the courage to proclaim Black Lives Matter, that all human beings are created in the Imago Dei, the image of God, and are loved by a God who fights for them when we oppress them. You are already on fire with the Holy Spirit. You don't have a choice anymore. And you think that buildings are burning and that is scary for the world? Just wait until the gospel is proclaimed. Thanks be to God.